the start of this war, we talked about battalion tactical groups, BTGs, as the currency of the Russians. None of that really is in train anymore. The battalion tactical groups have been replaced by very loose groupings of soldiers. Yeah, you might call them companies, battalions at some level, but the expertise and training of those units to do any sort of maneuver above a low level seems to be missing at the moment. So it'll be interesting to see if that maneuver can lead to breakthrough. I don't think it will at the moment, but can they up the norms which we've seen of how far a unit can move in a day, which, as I said, has been glacial in this war so far. I think Russia are at the moment taking advantage of this lull from a Ukrainian side until particularly the American support starts arriving in great detail. Now, we know since the $61 billion was voted for that the 3 packages have been allocated so far, the 3rd package this week of another $400 million to add to the 7.1 billion, I think, which was given before that. But like all these things, the central problem of logistic planning and therefore operational planning from a Ukrainian perspective involves the differential in lead time. Until you can get those things in theatre, you're going to be on the back foot. Now, that doesn't mean that things are completely written off from a Ukrainian perspective. And I think one of the things, again, which will be interesting to look at, particularly in what is happening at the moment in the Kharkiv Oblast and maybe to a limited extent in the Sumy Oblast, is can Russia increase its tempo of operations? Because what we've seen previously in this war is that after an initial shock or surprise, things regress to a norm, and the norm is what we call entropy in the military. That is, the advances have been at a glacial pace. Now, we used to talk about in the Cold War days a thing called the Operational Maneuver Group. That was the exploitation echelon which would break through a gap created by your initial maneuver forces. Then we might recall that at the start of this war we talked about battalion tactical groups, BTGs, as the currency of the Russians. None of that really is in train anymore. The battalion tactical groups have been replaced by very loose groupings of soldiers. Yeah, you might call them companies, battalions at some level, but the expertise and training of those units to do any sort of maneuver above a low level seems to be missing at the moment. So it'll be interesting to see if that maneuver can lead to breakthrough. I don't think it will at the moment, but can they up the norms which we've seen of how far a unit can move in a day, which, as I said, has been glacial in this war so far, mainly because of the transparency of the battlefield to all the sensors and satellite technology, drones, etc., which really do seem to have caveated the movement which both sides have been able to conduct on offensive operations.
I want to come back to the situation specifically in Kharkiv in a moment. Just on Andrei Belyasov replacing Shoigu as defense minister, as you mentioned, Chip, he is a technocrat, formerly was the deputy prime minister. He's a trained economist. Do you think that's a sign that Vladimir Putin is worried about the rising cost of this war for Russia?
Yeah, I think he would be, and we see that also in both deep battles really at the moment. So from the cost being imposed on Russia by Ukraine's deep battle is particularly in the oil refinery sector. So again, we think that something like 14%, probably plus now, of refinery capacity of Russia has now been destroyed by Ukraine. And that's important, not just in terms of the amount so far, but in terms of the ruthless application to do that. Because certainly one of the lessons from the Second World War was that it makes far more sense to destroy 50% of one industry than 5% of 10 industries in terms of impact and effect. And we know the effect of that already is being higher prices for the population of Russia, and the fact that they can't export as much now, and they're having to make contingency plans to import gasoline, particularly from, for example, Kazakhstan. So that, from a deep battle perspective of Ukraine, seems to have raised the cost to Russia. It's not particularly at the moment, an either or, but it could come a time when it's either war or peace. What do you want, your economy or war? Similarly, if you reverse that coin from the other side, this is where potentially the Russians don't need to take Kharkiv as a city or Sumy as a city, because they also, in terms of their now application of power or force on the energy sector, are disrupting in a way they didn't really do in the winter of 22-23 by going for certainly thermal plants and key targets in the way they didn't in 22. And that's really been enabled by this starvation and partly of the air defense assets of Ukraine. So, for example, we've seen in the last 6 months a degradation so that the interception rate, particularly of ballistic missiles, has gone down from 73% to 46%. And of course, the Russians have learned as well, because not only do we look at what we call battle damage assessment, BDA, but you also look in the ways that you attack of a thing called military effectiveness assessment. And if you're doing something and it's not working in terms of your attack vectors, the way you approach with your missiles, drones, etc., the sequencing of those, then you've got to go back and work out what will work. And the Russians seem to have been able to do that, partly because of this lack of air defense, but because they've not been stupid all the time.
Do you think it will lead to a significant shift in the tactics we see deployed by Russia on the front line? It's interesting that Belisov has spoken previously about the need to have a more canny use of UAVs, for example. Do you think we will see a notable shift?
Well, I don't think he's one to get involved in that sort of detail and activity. That's for the military commanders to do. So they will always shift their tactics according to need. So we've seen, for example, a greater relationship between the use of drones, UAVs, and electronic warfare assets from the Russian side. We've also seen, in the absence of this air defence, a greater ability to use close air support for the Russian side. So not only is it vital that those ammunition flows get to Ukraine in a timely fashion, but it also to also disrupt that equation, we need the aircraft, the F-16s, to come online as quickly as possible. We know the basic training's over, but getting the pilots up to both a combat standard and, of course, the engineers, weaponeers, and all those other people to enable the F-16s to get into theatre would be a great development for the Ukrainians. So what we probably can say at the moment, in the way that I said this in June 22, is that the Ukrainians at the moment are losing slowly, and that there is a eroding stalemate. Now, an eroding stalemate is such that an erosion can become a landslide. I don't think it will, and I don't think we're anything near there. But one of the key things about the Russian deep battle on Kharkiv city, is that one of the objectives there is potentially to make sure that the population just can't live there. And that is the second largest city in Ukraine. And if you have these refugee flows, significant refugee flows, then that can create a psychological shock amongst the population. And of course, I've always said this, that in Clausewitzian times, wars end because either your military refused to fight, your population have had enough, or you have the elites which say enough is enough. Now, we've not reached the point of either of those occurring on either of the sides, and that means we're not near the point of anywhere near negotiations from any point of view, from either Ukrainian or Russian point of view. But that is something that you would be looking at, because one of the things which history also tells us, particularly from the Ministry of Morale in the UK in the Second World War, is you need hope for the future. So there's got to be that hope for the better future. And we would hope that at the moment that the arms flows from America and the West generally will help stabilize and then push that back into 2025.
Given the Russian advances in Kharkiv Oblast at the moment, what do you think that means for Kharkiv city itself?
Well, I think it's pretty devastating. I think you will see some of these refugee flows. So the key thing from the Russian perspective is not trying to envelop and encircle Kharkiv, and I don't think they have the forces for that. The number in the northern military district, which is being quoted, is around somewhere between 30 and 40,000 troops. But they will get into a position where they have potentially fire control of Kharkiv. That is, they can use their both their barrel and tube systems in a manner which is pretty benign for them, and that would just sap the morale of the people in Kharkiv and would lead to more and more deaths and therefore these refugee flows. So that's the key thing for them, putting Kharkiv into a position where people flee. And there's a reason for this, I think. So we know that one of the objectives this year of the Russians is to capture finally both Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts. One of the other objectives is to create a buffer zone on the border. And if you look at the configuration of sort of Sumy Oblast through Kharkiv, around to Donetsk, Luhansk, and then through Zaporizhia, you're really getting a sort of horseshoe. And this horseshoe, from their perspective, might provide this kind of buffer zone which they're on about. Now, in reality, this is kind of nonsense given the weapons these days which can travel huge distances, cruise missiles and things like that. But in terms of selling that to the German public, to the Russian public, and also a concept which they might kind of try and sell in the minds of the West, and they've always said that they're not really interested in negotiations or negotiating. They're interested in negotiations, but it's selling fait accompli to the West, and there are always useful idiots in the West who might roll over to those sorts of things. And that's why we've got to get away from this notion that Ukraine can never be victorious and Russia can never lose. War is full of so many variables, and both of those things could be reversed at any one time.
And that's a really good note to end on, because I think, given the advances we've seen on the ground from Russia in recent weeks, it can be easy to lose sight of the fact this war is winnable for Ukraine with the right support.
Yeah, I think that's true. And again, this comes back to both sides' concept of victories. There's no way Russia is going to be rolling all the way over to the Polish border. It is a collapse of the Ukrainian will or military or Western support which would lead to them having success. Because very early on in the conflict, we have to remember that it was Zelensky who said, you're going to have to talk to us sometime, but we need to set the conditions for Ukraine to be as successful as possible so that Russia have to talk from a back foot position. That is the key to this, and that's where the theory of victory goes through, for example, as we've always said, through to Crimea, and upsetting that equation for Putin and making sure that they can't govern, and rather in Machiavelli terms, the notion that he who lays siege to a city which has had freedom will never be able to sleep safely.
Thank you for watching Frontline for Times Radio. For more, click subscribe on our YouTube channel. You can listen to Times Radio, and you can read more about the war in Ukraine and global security with your Times digital subscription.